Ladies and gentlemen, atheist slash agnostic New Testament scholar, Dr. Bart Ehrman at UNC Chapel Hill, who wrote several books that are skeptical of Christianity. One of them, of course, is called Misquoting Jesus, but he's written several others. He said this in a debate. He said, did Jesus die on the day before the Passover meal was eaten, as John explicitly says? Or did he die after it was eaten, as Mark explicitly says? Did he die at noon, as in John, or at 9 a.m., as in Mark? Did Jesus carry his cross the entire way himself, or did Simon of Cyrene carry his cross? It depends on which gospel you read. Did the curtain in the temple rip in half before Jesus died or after he died? It depends on which gospel you read. Who went to the tomb on the third day? Was it Mary alone, or was it Mary with other women? If it was Mary with other women, how many other women were there? Which ones were they? And what were their names? Was the stone rolled away before they got there or not? What did they see in the tomb? Did they see a man? Did they see two men? Or did they see an angel? It depends on which account you read, unquote. In other words, do we have reason to distrust the New Testament documents, particularly the Gospels, on the very central fact of Christianity, and that is the resurrection? It depends on which gospel you read. Are they hopelessly contradictory? Can we trust these accounts? Well, my guest today is an expert in eyewitness testimony. He's taken it for years and brought people to trial over eyewitness testimony. His name, of course, is the great J. Warner Wallace. He's with us again. He was on last week in the podcast we air on the American Family Radio Network because we were discussing his brand new graphic novel that he's written with his son called Case Files, Murder and Meaning. If you hadn't listened to the podcast last week, you need to. But today we're shifting gears and we're talking a little bit about eyewitness testimony. So, Jim, I know you've interacted with Bart Ehrman before, particularly in writing. Does he have a point here? What would you say if you were debating him and he had brought this up?
Well, a couple of things. So yeah, of course, I try to be pretty fair about, and I have written a little bit about Bart, but not too much. I don't find myself kind of trying to be an adversarial role. I mean, everyone's got some observations they make about eyewitness claims. Few people, though, have had to bring eyewitness claims to trial to test them in front of a jury, and that's one of the benefits you get, right? Like, I'm not a biblical scholar, but I do understand what eyewitness testimony looks like, and I've never had a case ever in which I didn't have what somebody could call contradictory eyewitness accounts. I mean, I just have never had a clean case like that. We've never lost a case because it turns out we have to kind of define like what is necessary to prove an event in the past. Whether that past is 5 weeks ago, 5 years ago, 5 decades ago, or 5 centuries ago, the question is, what do you need? How much certainty do I need? Now, first of all, it's really easy to dump 20 alleged Bible contradictions in one sentence and make this overwhelming, like, death by 1,000 paper cut kind of objection. But the reality of it is that most of the things he's talking about have been really easily addressed for centuries. And, if you appear to be a man and you appear as an angel who appears to be a man, you're going to get a variety of different descriptions of that being. And if there's, two present, there's also one present. So depending on what you're trying to chronicle, the person who spoke to you, that was one of those two angels. And so that's who appears in that one. Look, in the end, what typically is offered as a unreconcilable contradiction is really not that at all. It's about what I choose to say as a witness. Now, let me tell you how we clear it up in real life. So I get a case, and it's 10 years after the fact, and I've got 5 eyewitness accounts. They are not written by the eyewitnesses. We don't do that. We don't give them a pen and write them. What we do is we have detectives or police officers in the field or in the office interview eyewitnesses and then write a supplemental report that contains the eyewitness account. So the idea, for example, well, you can't trust Luke because he wasn't an eyewitness. Well, no, he's like the detective who's interviewing the eyewitness. It's still an eyewitness account. It's just recorded by a report writer. That's what every case I've ever worked has. So in the end, Mark. Well, who's Mark? Well, Mark is sitting at the feet of Peter. I think there's more than ample both historical and internal evidence to suggest that Mark is really just chronicling the stories of Peter. So in the end, he's the report writer for Peter's account. So you're going to have to kind of weigh these and ask yourself the question, are these eyewitness accounts? Now, I've seen scholars, our friends, who will quickly kind of point to some genre of literature to try to reconcile these differences. But I'm just telling you, if you've got 5 eyewitnesses to a case that happened a year ago, you're going to have what appear to be irreconcilable differences in the accounts. Now, how do I solve it typically? Well, if it's just a decade ago, hopefully these folks are still alive. And I can ask follow-up questions. Because I see in this report you mentioned that this one person said something. Did you see anything else there at that scene? I won't tip to him that I'm looking for, did you see 2 people? But I'll just, did you see anything else there? And now he's going to offer me another part of the story that in the first interview was not the focus of the interview for any variety of reasons. So because I have a second chance to interview him, typically you can reconcile all of the things that appear to be irreconcilable differences, but were simply a matter of either perspective or attitude or a reflection of prior commitments of the witness before he did the interview. Now, here's the other problem I have, though. I have many accounts where both the witness and the report writer are both dead. Hey, by the way, sometimes the witness is dead, but the report writer I can interview, and I'll say, look, he only says he saw one person here. And he might remember, well, no, he saw the same number of people everybody else did, but when I wrote the report, I was just focused on what that one person said. So sometimes the report writer can straighten it out for you if you can re-interview him. But sadly, there are cases I have where both are dead, the witness and the report writer. Well, now what do I do? By the way, you don't think a defense attorney is going to make a huge deal out of this? Of course. Of course they are. It's going to sound a lot like Bart Ehrman just sounded in making that case. And what we have to do is help jurors to understand that even in the same observation, I mean, I wish you could run that test in front of a jury, right? Or have somebody come in and smack me in the back of the head and run out of the courtroom and say, now, jurors, I want you to all write down what you just said. You would see the same level of apparent disagreement for what you know just happened. Just happened. This is because what we do is when we sit as a witness, we bring into the experience all of our own past experiences, all of our desires that help us to focus on certain things you're interested in, you will focus on. If you're somebody who loves shoes, you might know what kind of shoe this guy's wearing. And you could describe it in a way that others would say, I wasn't even sure if he was wearing shoes. Yeah, or I might mistakenly think he's wearing. Now, why would God, this is what it comes down to though. We have a sense that we have defined terms when it comes to biblical inerrancy and biblical the biblical scriptures that in some ways, why would God, for example, allow there to be differences, textual differences? I mean, just the nature of the report. Why would he allow these differences that seem confusing? And by the way, you don't think these were available and obvious to people in the first century who were assembling the canon? You don't think that Irenaeus, you don't think that Ignatius could look at those gospels and say, these seem to be slightly different? Well, clearly they knew enough in the earliest ages of this to not flinch under the differences because they had access to the people who actually wrote the accounts. And so they could actually do some interviewing of themselves. We don't have that access now. So my thinking on this is that if God wanted to give us 4 accounts that actually met the criteria and standard of any other eyewitness account you might learn of in your own experience as a detective, these 4 accounts have the exact level of variation I would expect to see from 4 eyewitnesses. But again, the idea that I can throw out a number of these contradictions, which have been asked and answered for thousands of years, it really, to me, is a bit of a sneaky play, if you think about it.
You say, I've heard you say this before, that whenever you were at a crime scene and you knew there were eyewitnesses around, you would ensure that the eyewitnesses were separated. In other words, you wouldn't put them all in the back of, say, the same police cruiser, because if they started talking to one another, they may iron out their stories. Why? Unpack that further. Why would you separate them? You wanted variation, in other words, didn't you?
Well, yeah, let's put it this way. If we had one gospel, there'd be no variations.
Right.
Yeah. One gospel, no variations.
Yeah.
And so, but with 2, now we're tempted. Should we harmonize these?
Yeah.
There were people in history who who tried to harmonize
Sure.
the Gospels.
Yeah.
And they did that because they saw the same thing that we're seeing thousands of years ago. They saw the same thing we're seeing. I don't want the harmonization because the harmonization always comes with information loss. You're going to have, I want the subtle differences that are almost confusing, head-scratching differences. I want those because there's some truth that's embedded in there that will account for the differences in the observations or the differences in the descriptions of the observations. It's either going to tell me something about a more robust nature of the event itself or something about the report giver. Like, why would he say it this way? That's going to tell me something about the author, because he might be pinning on something different or have his own set of commitments coming into it. And God allows the biblical authors to retain their unique personal dispositions as they're writing the account. And that's why you get these accounts. Now, it's almost like this sense that if this is God ordained, they should be word for word identical. Well, if that was the case, why would you need 4 Gospels? You wouldn't. You just need one. The reason why we have 4 Gospels is because the picture is so much more robust. And we're going to learn about that picture. That's why I tell the dispatchers, separate the eyewitnesses. Don't let them harmonize their statement before I get there. Our job as the detective who's reading the reports decades later is to think about the inferences in the harmonization. Like what's the bigger, robust picture? I do not want someone else doing that work before I get there. Give it to me in its messiest form, because that's how humans are.
How often has it happened in your experience where a judge or an attorney is able to identify that 2 eyewitnesses were in collusion to make up a story, and they almost say the same thing word for word, and either the defense attorney or the judge says, you guys are in collusion here? Does that ever happen?
Oh, gosh. I mean, it happens usually long before filing. So in other words, one of the ways we catch people who are making these kinds of claims is that they are colluding. They're making a false claim, and we can catch it before we even get to a filing point. But yeah, that often, it's so great because, what we're talking about are things that, if you think about it, you innately know are true. If you've raised kids, you know when they're lying to you because their stories are so aligned, right? And so when you have a jury and they even hear this close alignment of testimony, you can tell they're innately suspicious before you have to bring it up in the closing argument. Like, they already get it. They already don't trust these 2 guys because of how close their stories are. So this is what's so great about just having an intuitive sense. Here's what I would say to Bart. And not to Bart, just to anybody who's struggling with this kind of thinking on it. If all we had were 4 accounts of an ancient man called Jesus, and by the way, Bart does not just deny Jesus' existence. Bart believes there is a Jesus of Nazareth.
Who was crucified.
Yeah. So I would say that if you were to take out all of but he's not born of a virgin anymore, take out all of his miracles. He never fed 5,000, never walked on water. He didn't rise from the grave. He didn't ascend into heaven. Just a dude who was smart, preached some amazing sermons, lived an amazing ministry life, and then eventually died of just whatever. He could even be crucified, let's say, but he dies crucified. Okay, no scholar on either side of the aisle would doubt the historicity of Jesus, even with all of these variations, which are easily reconcilable, but that they will point to as irreconcilable contradictions. Nobody would doubt the historicity of Jesus. He is the most and best attested ancient until you add one miracle. Now you add a supernatural element to this story, and now everyone's like, yeah, this can't be true. And it's not based on the manuscript evidence or the number of manuscripts we have or our ability to return to the original intent of those manuscripts because of all the copies we have. It's not based on all that. It's all based on a presuppositional bias against the supernatural. Because without the supernatural, no one's going to flinch. And if what Bart is doing is he's just saying, hey, I'm going to strip out the supernatural, and now that's the version of Jesus I believe. The version that has no supernatural in it. Well, okay, so now what's this whole argument about? By the way, the version of this, you believe that version of Jesus, even with all the contradictions you allegedly say are in the New Testament, but you just strip out the supernatural. So there's a version of Jesus you believe in, but it's the one that doesn't ask you to bend your knee. It's the one who's not God.
Yeah.
It's the one who doesn't claim authority as God. It's the one that says you believe in the version of Jesus that just becomes a character in history, not one that says, Bart, your identity is not in you. your identity is in me. That version is offensive to a lot of people.
Right.
And it's not so much about the historical claims.
Well,
it's really more about like, where do we form our identity? What makes us valuable?
True. And when Bart's been asked, his real problem with Christianity is not alleged contradictions in the New Testament documents. His problem is he thinks the Bible is an inadequate explanation for the problem of evil.
Right.
So,
and he wrote a book about this.
Yeah,
but let me put it this way.
Yeah.
It's another kind of tell on this. And he writes this in the introduction to Jesus Interrupted, where he talks about his relationship with Bruce Metzger.
Yes.
And remember, these two guys are two detectives who are standing at the edge of a crime scene. And they're both standing with their detective suits, kind of like our friend Greg Kokel talks about Columbo in his jacket, right? And he's got his trench coat on. And so these two detectives are sitting there both, and they've got their cigars, and they're like looking at each other, and they're looking across the yellow tape, and they're looking at the same exact evidence in the crime scene, the exact same evidence. There's not a single piece of evidence in that crime scene that Bart is looking at that Bruce didn't look at first. Not only that, Bruce has got better pedigree, went to a better detective school. All three of his schools were better pedigree. As a matter of fact, Bruce is the dude, the FTO, the field training officer, who trained up Bart to even get this job as a detective to begin with.
Before we go any further, just so our listeners know, Jim here is talking about Bruce Metzger, who was probably the top manuscript scholar in the world of the 20th century. He taught at Princeton University. He actually had Bart Ehrman as a student, and together they updated Metzger's classic academic work called The Text of the New Testament the same year he put out Misquoting Jesus. But anyway, okay, so you're
so here they are, these two detectives.
One Bruce is and Bart together. Okay,
yes, they're two detectives looking across that yellow tape, looking at that evidence. Everything that the young detective Bart Ehrman is looking at, the old guy is going, yeah, it's been there, done that. Already saw that. I'm surprised it took you this long to notice it, but I've already seen that stuff. As a matter of fact, this is his training officer. This is the younger guy is basically the trainee of the older guy, and the older guy has got his pedigree, both his bachelor's, his master's, and his PhD from Princeton, and the younger guy has got his bachelor's from Moody, which is great. I mean, it's fine, but it's not Princeton, you know, in terms of the secular world for sure. Got his master's at Wheaton, which is okay, but it's not, and then he finally gets his PhD when he goes under the wing of Bruce Metzger. Here's my point. They're both these two detectives smoking the same cigars, looking across the line, and one is going, yeah, completely different. Look, Bruce died as a believing Christian, knowing all the stuff that Bart knew, and knowing it longer, and being the trainer of Bart. It's not about what's on the other side of the yellow tape. I guess Bart is the only one who knew about these differences in the Gospels. No, Bruce knew about all those differences too. There's not a single piece of evidence that Bruce wasn't aware of. And he talks about this in his interview with Lee Strobel. And so this, in the end though, he's unflinching. And not because he has a prior commitment to it. He's looking at the same evidence. So you know it's not about the evidence. It's never been about the evidence. This is true for jurors. I know that there are some jurors I could impanel that will never convict, and even on an overwhelming case. Why? Because they enter the box with prior commitments, prior emotional commitments, prior lifestyle commitments, prior presuppositional commitments. And we have a voir dire process so we can interview the jurors to discover their prior commitments. And both sides do this, the prosecution and the defense, because they don't want people coming in who are so committed to their prior commitments that they won't change their mind. And this is what happens, right? And so it turns out that what determines your verdict often in these kinds of cases is your prior commitments, not the evidence. It's not about the evidence. If it was, either Bruce would agree with Bart or Bart would agree with Bruce.
Well, let me play devil's advocate for a second. Let's suppose that it's Metzger that has the prior commitments. He wants to believe in God, and Bart is being a little bit more honest. How does the evidence favor Bruce, even though he may have a prior commitment?
Well, okay, first of all, you got to ask yourself, what is the prior commitment here? I suspect largely what it is either a prior commitment to either open-handed supernaturalism, I believe in such things, or nope, I don't believe in anything supernatural, nothing that can't be explained with space-time, matter, chemistry, and physics. Or it may simply be a problem of a moral commitment.
Right.
Some moral commitment that says either I don't like what God's rules are, or I think that something about God is offensive, or I think something about God's judgment of me is offensive, whatever that may be. So it's going to be one of those two kinds of commitments, right? I think the question is, regardless of, yes, do both have commitments? Absolutely. There's something about Bruce, but here's my point. It's not about the evidence. It's all about the commitments. Mm-hmm. And I would say if you're somebody who's been raised in the church, you may have a set of prior commitments that also prevents you. As a matter of fact, how many people do we meet doing this work that have never even looked at the evidence for Christianity? They don't even care about it. That's not necessary to them. They've already got a prior commitment. They're in. You couldn't even talk me out of it. I'm in. Okay. Mm-hmm. I'm just committed to it. I love this life. Love me some Jesus. Love the kind of life it's created for me. I'm not moving. That could be as equally anti-intellectual approach as being committed against it. So my question is, are your commitments realistic? Are your commitments sound? So if your commitment is that you think that there's evil, and this would just exclude God, maybe you haven't quite thought clearly about how you could call something evil to begin with, number one. So it's about your commitments. Or if you think I'm committed natural, which is my thing. My thing was that I was a committed naturalist. I would have far been more likely to side with Bart. Because to me, the idea that any true explanation could include something outside of space-time, matter, physics, and chemistry was just stupid. I mean, there's no reason to go there. And now I'm not doing history anymore. I'm doing mythology. Now I'm not doing science anymore. I'm doing pseudoscience. This is what I would have said. So for me, it was about examining your commitments. Here's what I would say. If you think that the commitments, I do think commitments are what's keeping us, then just be the kind of person who examines your prior commitments. If you've got a good reason to reject I don't think I do. I realized at some point, no, I already believed there was something outside of space, time, and matter that was governing the universe because it was the creator of this universe. I think Big Bang cosmology is still the best explanation for the beginning of the universe. And if that's the case, I'm already stuck with something outside of space, time, and matter. So I just knew that my commitments weren't sound. And if I strip away the commitments, how strong is the evidence? It's really strong. Now, here's what I would say. Everyone talks about how, yes, eyewitness testimony can be some of the weakest forms of testimony because not only are eyewitnesses fallible, eyewitnesses lie. So I would say the same thing. I'd never trust an eyewitness. You shouldn't trust an eyewitness either. If it's a case from 30 years ago or anything in Scripture, what we do is we test eyewitnesses. And the jury instructions are very clear on this. Not only are they clear on how to test an eyewitness, they're clear on what to do with that guy, even though you don't like what he's saying. You don't like how he looks. You don't like his attitude. But if he passed the test, you're stuck with this guy. You're instructed that you cannot reject his testimony because he looks like your lying uncle, or he's the wrong race, or you don't like his attitude. Or no, you have to figure out where in these categories that are very specific does he fail. And if he fails, they're great. You can distrust him. But you can't just say, I distrust him because I don't like the guy. That is not the criteria that we're using. So that, for me, was open the door to be able to test these eyewitnesses. But let me just say this. The fact that the eyewitnesses differ is a selling point. It's not a detracting point. It was the very thing that got me interested. When I read through the Gospels for the very first time and I saw everything that Bart's talking about, I was encouraged. That's when I decided to test them, because I'll tell you what, I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting this typical boilerplate junk you get from liars. Instead, what I had were these subtle variations that were like, wow, that's the kind of thing a defense attorney is definitely going to twist.
I know you have it all in Cold Case Christianity, Jim, but give us a couple of these tests that you can use, not just to evaluate, say, the eyewitnesses in the New Testament, but eyewitnesses that might come before you on a crime.
Or your kids when they come home late tomorrow night. So there's four things there's actually like 13 questions, and there's some subtle variations. That's probably something I could also write, but I'm thinking who's going to buy a book like that? But I mean, how much deep in the weeds do you need to go? But it comes down to four basic principles, right? Number one, no witness can be a witness unless they're present.
So were
they're really there. And what typically happens is you'll get people who will claim to be there until the video shows they weren't, or until somehow they're discredited, because they're trying to help their brother who's been accused of a crime or whatever it is. So especially in old cases, because it's harder to tell was somebody actually there or not, going back 35 years. So we have to ask the question, if these are true eyewitness accounts, they cannot be written in the 2nd century because the writers would not have been there. And now look, it could be that some truth made it to the 2nd century, and there is some, but I want to know, and I would be far more trusting of an account if it is written within the lifetime of eyewitnesses who would know if it's a lie, because the best way to tell a lie about anybody is to wait till everyone who knows the truth is dead. So for me, that's one of the first criteria is how early are the Gospels written. Now, this is why this is helpful also. That single criteria will help you answer a lot of these responses, or at least rethink them, because if you can demonstrate they're written within, say, 30 years of the actual events, well, then you might want to ask yourself, why would they leave these variations in? I mean, clearly the people who knew what happened were still alive and could have said, take that out. That seems confusing, right? I mean, so the question is, if they're early, why leave what later could be considered an objectionable difference? Because at the time, apparently, these were not seen as objectionable differences, largely because they're written so early that the people who wrote them were still available to do the second step, which is, well, what do you mean by that?
Mm-hmm.
And I can get that personally without ever having to write that into the text again. And this is what happens in criminal trials. I get that personally. It's not going to rewrite the supplemental report. That supplemental report on its face still has the apparent contradiction. But I've already worked this out because I have access to the people who actually saw it. I think the early dating helps us in many other categories that you wouldn't expect it to help. But that's just one of the 4 criteria. The other one is, it's going to have to be corroborated in some way. But remember that corroboration will always be limited. It'll always only be a small percentage. We're not looking at video corroboration.
Right.
So if you're doing cases from the 80s, you don't have video corroboration. You're going to get one person who's going to substantiate 1% of the testimony, but that'll typically be considered by jurors to be corroboration. Does it corroborate every detail? No. But at least he was definitely there because I corroborated that at least, right? I can corroborate, yeah, he definitely saw this one piece because I can corroborate it in some way. Okay. So I would expect that. And by the way, you don't get that at all for lies. So if you look at the Book of Mormon, you're not going to find any level of corroboration that you're going to find satisfying. You're not going to be able to find a single city, a single name of a Mormon character anywhere on the North American continent. You're not going to find that in any dig because it's just not true. Even though you're not going to get a corroborative evidence for every single claim of the New Testament through archaeology, you're going to get a significant percentage. Whereas on the Mormon side, you're going to get 0. Right. 0 is a big number when you're looking at corroborative evidence. So I don't expect to get 100%. I expect to get some percent. So if I'm getting no percent, I'm suspicious.
Right.
So you're looking at both the corroboration, also internal consistency, like what do we know about the first century that seems to be substantiated by the text, or whatever the century is you're examining the case of. And then also you're going to want to look at, like, are they changing their story over time? I mean, Bart wrote a book called How Jesus Became God, where his principal claim is that there is a Jesus of Nazareth, a historical figure, Jesus of Nazareth, but he's not the Christ of Christianity. And how you get from the Jesus of Nazareth to the Christ of Christianity is the exaggeration of many centuries of distortion.
Yes, it's strange now that scholars are now saying exactly the opposite is true. Richard Bauckham has famously said the earliest Christology was already the highest Christology.
Oh, absolutely. This is why it was important to me. And I remember when I first was examining this, I wasn't a Christian yet, but I had the flu. I remember I had the flu. I can remember what I was laying in bed, and I was kind of like thinking about, like, how would this bothered me. Because that was kind of the biggest hurdle for me. I believed there was probably a Jesus, but I didn't believe he was the biblical version of Jesus. So I was just thinking as I'm laying in bed sick with the flu, how, I can't remember if Susie might be the one that kind of triggered this idea, but anyway, I knew how these cases work in criminal trials where someone will say you've tampered with the evidence. It's changed over the years. The only way we can combat that is to show the actual chain of custody so that the person who's evaluating it, the jury, can see, well, no, I know exactly who touched this and where this property was. So it couldn't have been tampered with. Well, I thought, is there a chain of custody for the New Testament? In other words, who saw Jesus first? He said something. Then who is the person he gave that information to? Because if they chronicled it, we'll know if the Jesus is simpler right away. We'll know that it's super, because it's going to evolve over time. And what Bart is claiming is that in the 300 plus years between the events and the canonization of the New Testament at the Council of Laodicea, somewhere in there, these changes were made over and over and over and over again. But if you continue to find that the first officers and the second officers in the chain of custody are always in agreement in different regions, because there's a chain of custody in Rome through Paul to Clement and Linus, and then downward. There's a chain of custody in Asia Minor through John, and then Ignatius, Polycarp, and Papias, through Irenaeus, through Hippolytus, all the way down. There's a chain of custody in North Africa through Peter to Mark and all the school in North Africa. So if you're in different regions, and the earliest versions of Christianity in the first and second officers in the chain of custody are all the same, born of a virgin, worked miracles, rose from the grave, ascended into heaven, you're stuck with that version. You don't have to say it's true. You can say it's not true, but you can't say it's a late lie, because it's neither late nor is it a legend. It's not a lie because it's the same story. It could be a lie, but it's not legendary. It's not an exaggeration over time. So you start to take kind of just whittle away at the objections. You're just testing the witness from different angles to see if they measure up. Now, I get it. There will be some people who will say, I don't care. The minute something supernatural enters into the narrative, it's got to be a lie. Are you crazy? It's got to be a lie. It's supernatural. But that exposes the bias against the supernatural. That's all that does.
The oddest thing, other than Big Bang cosmology, as you mentioned, if Genesis 1:1 is true, every other verse in the Bible is at least possible. You can't rule it out. The other interesting thing about this is they seem not to realize that if everything happens by nature, their thinking is happening completely by nature, and they have no grounds to believe what they are thinking is true, because their thoughts have come to them completely simply by the collision of molecules in their head. They're driven by the laws of physics, which would negate everything they're thinking, their skeptical thoughts anyway. So they're not taking into account the fact that our very ability to think requires something beyond the natural. Yes, we're using natural processes, of course, but it's not just natural processes. So atheism, materialistic atheism is self-defeating. And yet, so when someone like Bart Ehrman says this, they're actually defeating their entire argument. But we're running out of time, Jim. I want to talk about what I find very interesting is that even Bart Ehrman will admit that he thinks not only did Jesus die by crucifixion, that Jesus, at least the disciples believed Jesus had appeared to them risen. And so he thinks that the documents are reliable enough for him to conclude, yes, the disciples believe Jesus rose from the dead, but he doesn't give an alternative explanation. Why would he think these documents are reliable enough for him to say that the disciples believe Jesus rose from the dead, but on the other hand, he brings up these minor differences in the resurrection accounts to try and discount the reliability of the scriptures, yet he is agreeing on the major facts of Christianity. He just doesn't think that whatever they saw was the risen Jesus, that it was something else, and he doesn't explain what it was.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And here's how I always see it. Everyone's got some explanation for how to deal with these minimal claims. If you don't want to call them facts, fine, but there's minimal claims that are in Scripture. Interestingly, you have to trust the Scriptures enough to make the argument to begin with. You have to pick out the things you're going to try to contradict, or pick out the things you're going to try to nitpick. But where are you getting those from? If you can't trust the documents, you can't trust the documents. Can you trust the documents just enough to find the things you don't trust? That seems to be a bit of a contradiction. But more importantly, you'll notice that there are a number, and I think Bart, to his credit, has kind of tried to come up with another view. I think one of his books talks about how for many years, I do believe, I could be wrong, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that Bart accepted the idea of the empty tomb.
He did at one point.
Most
he
recent
seemed to have changed.
He changed that, and he basically says, hey, it could be that one person sees something, hallucinates something, he wants it so badly, but he's in a position of influence that it could then be used to leverage that influence to convince others. So you don't have to have a bunch of people in a group hallucination, because he rejects that theory. You don't even have to have a bunch of people coming together to lie in a conspiracy, because he rejects that theory. He even, in some ways, is contradicting his own idea that the story has been manipulated over time, that this is a legendary addition to the Jesus story. Because now, to make this claim, you're saying, no, it's not a legendary addition. It's the addition of somebody who had a hallucination but was influential enough to convince others. Here's my point, is that it turns out that there's maybe 6 or 7 alternative atheist explanations for the resurrection. There's the Christian explanation. He just rose from the grave. But some people think he lied. They lied as a group. They hallucinated it. They were mistaken. He wasn't really dead. An imposter stood in on the grave. One influential person had a vision and convinced the others. It was just a distortion over time as the legend. Okay, whatever your view is, they all know these views don't work, which is why there are 6 alternatives to the one claim of Christians. Because it turns out that if you're somebody who holds to atheist explanation 1, you reject 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. If you believe that number 3 is the correct, you reject as unreasonable 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6. Each atheist who makes a proposition about this knowingly rejects the explanation of all the others. They think that so it's atheists disagreeing that they're actually agreeing with us. Those other atheist positions are not true. They're not even workable, which is why they've picked the one they picked. And they don't agree because none of them work. So the simplest and clearest explanation, though, would require you to embrace a difficult truth, that something supernatural like a resurrection actually occurred in the first century. But if the only thing keeping you out of that difficult truth, quote unquote, is that you have a presuppositional bias to the supernatural, just remember, you're thinking right now with a mind that you think has the freedom to think. That's immaterial, which is, as Sam Harris has already talked about as a neuroscientist, doesn't even exist under atheism. You can't have a mind that has the freedom to think without being confined by physical prerequisites, right? Neurons that fire that cause a certain thought to appear to be free when in fact it isn't. It was predetermined by the sequence of firing. And that goes back all the way to the beginning of the universe.
In other words, that then, yeah.
Yeah, why trust that? Why make an argument for this? I'm just predestined to believe it. But the point I'm trying to make is that we have good reason to believe that something is governed. This is why when Thomas Nagel writes Mind and Cosmos, Mind and Cosmos, yeah. Yeah, when he writes this book, he recognizes that we're going to have to adapt as atheists to a view of the world that at least holds with an open hand the notion that there's something other than physical processes that are governing our universe. He's not a believer. He just sees the problem. And so this is why I'm going to hold I had at some point to say to yourself, okay, can you hold your bias against the supernatural with an open hand? That is, after all, the thing we're actually examining. Could you imagine deciding when I come into a room who the killer is before I even look at the room? I just know it's going to be this killer. Okay, that's not the fair way to run the investigation. I cannot come into an investigation of a supernatural claim like the resurrection by first rejecting everything supernatural. I have to hold it with an open hand. That's why that presuppositional bias is actually an investigation killer. It keeps you from even starting because you think you know the answer before you begin.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jim, you cover this so well in Cold Case Christianity. And friends, you probably know this, but there was an update to Cold Case Christianity a few years back. So the classic book has actually been updated. And I love that part about the chain of custody. That's kind of a unique contribution to that book there, Jim. I have it right up here on my shelf here. So friends, coldcasechristianity.com, Cold Case Christianity, the book is going to be very helpful. One last thing, Jim, that strikes me as odd too. Notice that people like Bart Ehrman, they attack these details that even if they're contradictory, don't in any way touch the credibility of the bigger issue that all the witnesses say Jesus rose from the dead. It's kind of like that old that old truth that the witnesses of the Titanic disagreed on how it sank. You know, some said it went down whole, others said it broke in two. And of course, you might figure out why they disagreed. You know, they were in shock. It was dark. They had different angles on the ship and couldn't see it break in two if it did, you know. But they all agreed the Titanic sank. Nobody would say that because they disagreed on how it sank, the Titanic didn't sink. They all agree on that. Isn't that kind of the same thing going on here? He's harping on these minor, trivial things that even if they are contradictory, don't affect the larger point that Jesus rose from the dead.
Oh, you have to bring this up, don't you? You couldn't let us get out clean. You couldn't. You have to bring this up.
You got 5 minutes, man. We got to go. Go.
Okay, so you had to bring this up so I can say the controversial thing. But let me just tell you that in criminal trials, we have a jury instruction. Here's what the jury instruction is. A witness can be wrong about a detail, yet still be considered reliable by the jury. That's just a jury instruction. I'm sure it's in every state in the land. Now, so again, if I say this, then everyone says, oh, you're saying, Jim, that the Gospels are wrong about, no, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that if you want it for the sake of argument, to say, oh, this is a jury instruction. There are no inerrant witnesses. There are no infallible in criminal trials. There are no inerrant, infallible witnesses in criminal trials. Yet we convict people all the time with sufficient evidence. You're not trying to convict somebody beyond a possible doubt. That's a huge high standard you're never going to reach. I've never reached it in any criminal trial. The highest standard in the land, because of human fallibility, is beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a lower standard. Why? Because we are finite humans who have a finite ability to even assess evidence. And you cannot hold as the standard possible doubt, because anything and everything is possible.
Sure. Yeah.
It's reasonable doubt. And here's what that means. It means that you have to get comfortable with witnesses who are going to make mistakes. Yet they're going to tell you something true you can act on. They can be true about the major things, wrong about the minor things, and still be considered a great witness for your case. We tell this to juries all the time. So even if just for sake of argument, you wanted to say, okay, Bart, you're right about all those things. So what's your point? If these were criminal trials, you still would convict that guy.
Yeah.
You're stuck with this guy. Regardless, you can say, well, yeah, he got the wrong. He's wrong. It was a turquoise shirt, and it was a long sleeve shirt. It wasn't a blue short sleeve shirt. So, okay.
Yeah. So he's still guilty. Yeah,
he's still guilty.
Okay.
Yeah. So so this is something that I think can be controversial, because we're not making claims right now about what set of contradictions we would just say are flat out wrong. But here's what I do know: I don't think you have to jump to some literary device to realize that. And what I see often in the scholarship, and I don't even consider myself a Christian apologist, Frank. I'm just a dude who got saved through apologetics, because I was a detective before. So I'll just tell you, though, that if you never talk to eyewitnesses, I certainly am not going to jump to a certain genre of literature from the past. Like in the 80s, this was what people said about. No, I'm not doing that, because it turns out this is what all witnesses do. We get some things right, we get some things wrong. Sometimes we get everything right, but we speak them in a way that appears to be wrong. Right. Our job as the detectives are to make sense of all that without just assuming everyone's lying.
J. Warner Wallace, ladies and gentlemen, what a great wealth of information for us. In addition to Cold Case Christianity, I want you guys to go out and get this brand new book. We talked about it on the last podcast. This is with his son, Jimmy, who's also a detective, by the way, beautifully illustrated and perfect, particularly for people who are interested in comics and/or kind of crime scene murder sort of stories. This one is called Case Files, Murder and Meaning. It's a subtle way of getting the gospel in and talking apologetics. You can give this to an unbeliever. They're not going to be cheesed out. It's not in any way cringy at all. It's very well done. It's actually illustrated by people who are associated with The Passion, if I'm not mistaken, Jim. Is that right?
The Chosen. The Chosen. I'm sorry. Yeah, they actually made a comic book series on The Chosen, and that's how we first got involved. We saw they were doing that work, so we wanted to hop in.
Yeah, so check that out, and also go to coldcasechristianity.com. I want to remind you that if you're listening to this on April 1st, on the 3rd, I'll be at Grand Canyon University at 1 p.m. with my friend Lucas Miles. We'll be on the campus somewhere doing Prove Me Wrong. And then on the weekend, I'll be in Albuquerque for the Unshaken Conference on April 5th, and then speaking at the church services April 5th and 6th. And then next Tuesday, the 8th, be at Sam Houston State for I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. These will all be live streamed, by the way, at least the university events will. Then out in Xenia, Ohio on the 13th. On the 14th, we'll be at Wright State University. All the details are on our website. Check it out. Now, Jim, I know you're doing some speaking a little bit around town. Where are you next? Can you tell our listeners where you're going to be?
I've got a care center on April 1st in Killeen, Texas. Also with the Reality Apologetics Conference, and a conference in Dallas area the following weekend. So hopefully I get to see you all there.
So is that April 5th?
That is.
April 5th. So Reality is going to be, that's a great conference for young people, ladies and gentlemen. Is that going to be at?
This is in Ohio, and I'm not even sure. It's a one-time location. Hopefully we get to do it there again, but it's our first time ever doing a Reality Student Apologetics Conference in Ohio. And I'm trying to think if it's that weekend or the weekend after, but it's one of those two weekends. So it's on our calendar, and our calendar is actually posted on the Cross-Examine website.
Yeah. But go to coldcasechristianity.com for more about Jim. He's doing great work as always. And now with his son, Jimmy, who is also has got an apologetics degree and is also a detective himself. So, Jim, great stuff as always, my friend. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Frank. I'm always indebted to you. Appreciate it.
That's the great J. Warner Wallace, ladies and gentlemen. So check out coldcasechristianity.com. And Lord willing, we will see you here next week. God bless.
If you're looking for solid answers to life's biggest questions, don't miss the latest episode of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, iHeart, OnePlace, and Podchaser. Tune in, discover the truth, and share it with someone who needs it. Let's keep spreading the truth together.